Hello and welcome to part 2 of our discussion of Matthew 16, 18, and 19, entitled, What is the Church? Now, as we discussed last time in part 1, Matthew 16, 18, and 19 are the first time in the New Testament that the church is mentioned. And so if we're going to figure out a biblical view of what the church is and what the mission of the church is, this verse is obviously highly important for us, these two verses. So last time we talked about the word church itself, focusing on the Greek word ecclesia, talking about its usage in the New Testament, its etymology, the implications of this word theologically, and then we drew some applications out of that. So this week we're going to actually dive into the verses and look at what they're talking about, specifically the phrase, "On this rock I will build my church." So to understand the phrase in the full context, we're going to start by reading the full passage. So we're going to read Matthew 16, verses 13 through 20 in the ESV here. Now, when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" And they said, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." He said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter replied, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." Then he strictly charged the disciples to tell no one that he was the Christ. All right, so again, our verses that we're focusing on are 18 and 19 here, and I want to really draw our attention specifically to this first phrase in verse 18. I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. Obviously, this is a highly debated passage here. It seems to be saying that Peter himself is the foundation of the church, and you could even use this verse to support the idea that the Pope has supreme authority over the church as the inheritor of Peter's office as the Bishop of Rome. So what is this verse actually teaching us? That's what I want to talk here today. So what is this verse actually teaching us here? Well, I want to do two things. First, I want to talk about what is actually happening in this passage, and then we're going to give three interpretational options. We'll talk through each of those options, their strengths and weaknesses. We'll analyze them and decide which option fits best with this text here and most faithfully represents what's happening here. Okay, so first, what is actually going on in this passage? So we have this statement, I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I'll build my church. This is Christ actually renaming Peter, giving him a nickname here. Now, as you're probably aware, Peter is not Simon Andrew's brother. That's not his given name. His given name is Simon or Simeon. Jesus renamed him to Peter. And you can see this not only in this passage, but also in Mark. And if you give me just a second, what is the passage? It's Mark 3:16. We can go ahead and turn there and here. In Mark 3:16, we've got a list of the 12 disciples. He appointed the 12. Simon, to whom he gave the name Peter. And we also see this in John 1:42. In John 1:42, Andrew brings Jesus to brings Simon to Jesus rather, brought him to Jesus. Jesus looked at him and said, "You are Simon, son of John." John rather than Jonah in this passage. It's possible that his father had a Hebrew name as well as a Greek name, perhaps Jonah and then John, just like maybe Paul had Saul and Paul. "You are Simon, son of John. You shall be called Cephas," which means Peter. Now, yeah, Cephas being the Aramaic equivalent of the Greek word Peter, Petros, and we'll talk about that word later. So Peter is renamed Peter from Simon. We see that. That's pretty obvious here from the text. Most of you are probably already aware of that. But why this renaming? What's the significance of this word name Peter, or in Aramaic, Kephas? Let's go back to Matthew here. Petros is the word in Greek. So he's renamed. Petros, which is a Greek word which means rock. So there's a play on words that's happening here that's really significant. What Jesus is essentially saying is, you are rock, and on this rock I will build my church. Now the question is, what exactly does that mean here? What does it mean? Does that mean that Peter himself is the foundation of the church? Or does maybe that mean something else here? Well, now that we've gotten down that there's a play on words happening between Peter's name and the Greek word for rock, Petra, let's talk about some interpretational options here. Well, the first option in this section is the most obvious option, that Peter himself is the foundation which Jesus is going to build his church on, that Peter is the rock. Now, actually, this is a pretty common interpretation even outside of Roman Catholicism. Obviously, Catholics would favor this interpretation because of their their strong emphasis on Peter and his authority. But a lot of Protestants still take this interpretation as well, because the passage doesn't necessarily say that Peter actually has supreme authority or that he's going to pass this authority down. And in fact, we do see Peter in the New Testament, especially in the book of Acts, taking on something of a leadership role after Christ's ascension and after the coming of the Holy Spirit. For instance, at Pentecost, all 12 apostles are preaching, but it is Peter's sermon, which is recorded for us in the book of Acts and seems to have taken primacy there in that section. Also, it is to Peter and to none of the other apostles that the vision of the sheet coming down from heaven with the unclean animals appears. And it is to Peter that the instruction comes to go to Cornelius' house, and it's Peter then who issues Gentiles into the church. So Peter does seem to have sort of a special leadership role amongst the apostles. This does need to be balanced out, though, with the realization that Peter isn't always at the top amongst the apostles. For instance, in Acts chapter, I believe it's 11, with the Jerusalem Council. I'm sorry, that's actually Acts 15. In Acts 15, the Jerusalem Council takes place, and Peter is not presiding over this. It appears that James, the Lord's brother, is actually the one presiding over that council. And then also in Galatians chapter 2, you have Paul recording how he confronted and rebuked Peter publicly. He says to his face, because he was separating himself from the Gentile believers, and that was not right for him to be doing that. So clearly, Peter is not an absolute monarch in the same way that the Pope is today. He did not wield that kind of authority. And although this verse might appear at first glance to be giving him that kind of authority, that's not what he used when you look at the rest of Scripture. So if Peter himself is the rock, it could just be saying that, he's going to have a major leadership role amongst the 12 apostles. He's going to be a big leader upon which Jesus is going to build the church. It's just saying that Jesus is giving Peter some kind of special role. The major strength of this position is that it seems to be the most simple and obvious position to take with the text itself. And when you have a difficult passage, all other things considered equally, usually it's best to just go with the simplest and the most obvious interpretation. And so in that way, this one seems to be the most faithful to the text just because it's the simplest. Additionally, it does, have some consistency with how we see Peter's role playing out later in the New Testament. A weakness of this view is that it seems a little bit out of place to name a person as being the foundation of the church. It seems very strange to me that Jesus would call Peter a foundation for the church. Like, why not something much bigger than a person? It seems almost even man-centered to say that. And again, it's not that Peter's building the church and that he's the one in charge. Jesus says, on this rock I will build my church. So it's Jesus building. But it still seems to give a little bit too much credit to Peter. So that's a weakness with this view. Let's move on to a second view, and this one attempting to address that maybe overemphasis that especially Rome gives to Peter here. Second interpretation is that when Jesus says on this rock, he's not referring to Peter, but rather he's actually pointing back to himself. So in this second option, Jesus would be saying, you are Peter, or you are a rock, but on this rock, pointing back to himself, I will build my church. So, in other words, Jesus is going to build the church on himself. So this view was held by Augustine. It's also held by the Reformers, including Luther, Calvin, Zwingli. So there's a lot of clout behind this position. This is a view that's also given in the old Scofield Reference Bible. That might be that might make you more inclined to take this view, or it might make you more inclined to stay away from this view, depending on your opinion about the old Scofield Reference Bible. One argument in favor of this view is that there is a slight difference between Peter's name and the word that Jesus uses for rock. And let me show you that here. So Peter's name in Greek is Petros. Let's get this to come up. There we go. It looks like this. It's Petros, Petros. And as you can see here, every time this word is used in the New Testament, some 155 times, if you look at this graph up here, every time it's used, it's referring to Peter himself. However, Petros is also a word that's used outside the Bible in other Greek to mean sort of like a slab, or like a stone that you could use as a foundation, like a flat stone. And then the word that Jesus uses after this is actually Petra, not Petros. So there's a slight difference between these two words. So it goes from Petros, Petros, to Petra, Petra. This is the more common word for rock, rocks. You can see also it's sometimes used as an adjective. There is a slight, maybe different connotation here. Petra is sometimes used to mean like a rocky shelf. It's slightly different. Also, Petra is a feminine word, just like in Spanish or some other languages. Nouns and adjectives are given genders in Greek, and so Petra is a feminine word, whereas Petros is masculine. Obviously, Jesus gave Peter the masculine form of this word, attributed to him since he's male. And so proponents of the view that Jesus is the rock will focus in on this fact that the words are slightly different. He says, you are Petros, and on this Petra I will build my church. Now, the problem with this argument is that it assumes that Jesus was actually speaking Koine Greek to Peter in this point. But that's probably not the case. Now, Koine Greek, or Common Greek, is what that Koine means, was the language of the Roman Empire. It's a common language of the Roman Empire. When Alexander the Great expanded the Greek Empire, he spread the Greek language with him, and that's how Koine Greek came into being. And when the Roman Empire came, they continued to use Koine as the common tongue, because all the people who were in the old Greek Empire spoke it. But in regional areas, they still spoke their own languages. So in Italy, they would probably be speaking Latin. And in Judea, the Hebrews there were speaking Aramaic, which is a derivative of Hebrew, ancient Hebrew. However, they would have all known Greek, and the authors of the Bible wrote the Bible in Greek because they wanted it to be read widely throughout the empire, but they were probably speaking Aramaic amongst themselves. So when Jesus actually said these words to Peter, he probably wasn't using two different words. He would have been saying the Aramaic word for rock, which is kephas, or as we pronounce it when we see it in the Bible, Cephas. We see it in Romans chapter 1. Paul calls Peter Cephas. He also calls Peter Cephas in Galatians 2. We mentioned that earlier when he says he confronted Peter. He actually says, when I confronted Cephas. At least it's translated that way in the King James. Some translations, they might just go ahead and say Peter because that's the more common name. But we do see the name Cephas being used in the New Testament, referring to Peter. So it's probably the case that Jesus was actually saying the word Cephas here And there's not a lot of reason to believe that he used a different Aramaic word for rock, following that statement. It's most likely that we don't really have another option for a word that he could have used. So it's probably best to assume that Jesus in, didn't intend to differentiate between Peter and the other rock on which he's going to build his church. It's probably a pretty specious assumption to make. Certainly not one you want to base an argument off of. Now, the strength of this view, however, regardless of that argument, is that, it puts a lot of emphasis on Christ as the foundation of the church. And that is certainly something I'm a fan of. Um, we want to find Christ's role in every passage that we see. And Christ being the foundation of the church sounds a whole lot better and more correct than Peter being the foundation of the church, or any man being the foundation of the church. But the problem with this view is it seems strange for Christ to refer to himself as both the builder and the foundation. He seems to be deliberately differentiating between himself as the builder of the church and the rock on which the church is being built. So to say that he's both the builder and the foundation seems to it seems to fight against the way the passage is actually flowing. So it's textually speaking, it's probably not the best option to take based on that. I just think it's probably not the best view, given the way the text is formed. And if you're trying to really pay close attention to what he's saying, it doesn't really seem to make sense. So the third interpretational option is that the rock on which Christ is going to build his church is neither Peter nor Jesus himself, but rather Peter's confession that Jesus is the Christ. Now, this option was ascribed to by John Chrysostom amongst the early church fathers. And in modern times, it's also subscribed to by John MacArthur. John MacArthur puts this in his study Bible on this passage, that the rock is not Peter, but rather Peter's confession that Jesus is the Christ. And so, in other words, Jesus is saying, "You are Peter," and he's renaming him in honor of sort of his confession that you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. But the rock that he's referring to is the statement that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. So there's a lot of really strong textual evidence for this view. And I didn't even realize this until I was taking the class Advanced Systematic Theology at Bob Jones Seminary, where I'm still a student, under Dr. Leighton Talbert. And he gave us a lot of just really strong points for this particular view. I'm going to share with you some of those points that came out of the notes that I got out of that class. So notice that Jesus initiates this whole conversation in verse 13 by talking about what people confess about him. He says, who do people say that the Son of Man is? This is a question about what is your confession that I am? What is people's confession about me? So he starts this in terms of a confession. Secondly, it is Peter's confession that he is the Christ that prompts Jesus's renaming of him, that prompts this response. It is the confession itself is the reason that he says this to Peter. Another point is that this confession that Jesus is the Christ is the heart of the gospel. And you must confess that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, if you're going to become a member of the church. So it makes a lot of sense why this would be the rock on which the church is built. Additionally, no human or group of humans, it says in his notes, is big enough to be the foundation of the church. And I certainly agree with that sentiment. It seems very strange to point to one person as being the foundation of the church if that person is not Christ. Finally, though, the confession is the focus of this passage, not Peter. And this is, I think, the strongest argument in favor of this position. If we look down again at verse 20, notice that it closes not talking about Peter, but this passage closes talking about that confession. He strictly charged the disciples to tell no one that he was the Christ. Why? Well, it's because he wasn't ready to reveal himself yet to the masses. He's only revealing himself to his close followers. It's almost an inclusio here. Like if we look at the beginning again, we see this statement that is calling us to think about who Jesus is, and then it ends off with, "Don't tell people about who Jesus is." So the passage is really blocked off by this idea of a confession of Christ. And so I actually find this a pretty strong argument in favor of this position. Now, when I took the class, I actually didn't find these arguments that convincing at the time, especially looking at the play on words here that's happening with Peter's name. You are Petros, and on this Petra I will build my church. I felt like that was pretty strong evidence that, like, you really can't take it as any other way as than Peter is the rock. Um, Looking at these points again in preparation for this video, it's really hard for me to just go away from this third option, that it's the confession. Um, I like the confession a little bit better at this point than the option that Peter is the rock. A lot, really, mainly for the purpose that it does seem to me at this point that it is the confession, not Peter, that's central to this passage, and also that it just doesn't sit right with me to say that Peter's the foundation of the church. Yes, he played a big leadership role, but that doesn't. It still seems weird to call him the foundation. Um, so at this, if I had to pick one option that's best, I feel like now I would choose the option of Peter's confession as being the rock on which Christ would build the church. But in summary, what I want to say here is that whichever of these three options you ascribe to, the main point of this is really not the identity of the rock, but rather that Jesus is going to build his church. That's really the point he's making. Whether it's Peter, whether it's Peter's confession, or whether it's Jesus himself as the foundation, Jesus is the one who's going to build the church. And if that's the case, you and I have to trust that he's going to build it. That doesn't mean that we have no responsibility. You and I still have to go out and spread the gospel and make a difference in the world and tell people about Jesus and bring them into the church. But when it seems like all the work we're doing is going nowhere, and when it seems like it's all in vain, we've got to trust that God is going to be the one that builds it. So thanks for watching. I hope you got something out of this video, and I'll see you guys next time in part 3. Jesus is the one who's going to build his church. Ooh, I'm getting a tornado warning. Clear that.